think it was early summer 2006. And I was 3 to 4 years into my career working at an engineering and safety design firm in Bristol. I'd walked to work pretty confident of a nice, relaxing day. I didn't really have anything in the schedule and was going to catch up on some admin. So I sat down at my desk at about 8:30 and just made a coffee. And the director of the design firm came up to me and he said, "John, I need you to come with me immediately to my office to sign a non-disclosure agreement." So I thought, okay. I didn't realize then that in less than 4 hours, I would be stood in a boardroom with 2 sets of lawyers. The first group representing a product design firm, and the second group representing the family of a man who at that point in time was critically ill in Southampton General Hospital. They asked me one question. This is after I'd been there for about 2 hours. They said, "John, in your professional design opinion, has the product we made got the potential to kill a man?" Something, somewhere, had gone wrong. This is a talk that I've wanted to give for quite a while, and what I want to do today is to kind of remind the user experience community of many things that I believe sometimes have been lost or forgotten, that looking to the future and the challenges that we face in the next 10 to 15 years will be all the more important. I'm not a massive fan of starting presentations with, "Hello, I'm John." But in this context, I do really want to take a moment to outline some of my experience and why I'm talking about some of the subject matter today. I'm about 17 years into my career now, something like that, a bit more grey hair and a beard. But my career is effectively a bit of a dichotomy because I began in safety engineering, working in the worlds of oil refineries, nuclear power plants, aircraft control rooms, very well-established, industrialized places. But then for the last 10 years, whilst I've been at Nemensa, I've also been working in the very 21st century mindset of modern digital delivery. And it is the clash of these two areas that really affects much of my perspective and influences what I'd like to talk about today. There's a series of trends that has been occurring within the user experience design community that are not necessarily bad, but they are a movement in one direction. In my opinion, we've become obsessed with process. It's impossible for me to go on Twitter without fundamentally seeing people arguing around, "You should probably follow Pixar's design process," or "You should probably follow Disney's design process." That's great. Well, why don't you design your own design process? We also have a ridiculous obsession at the moment with tools. There'll be online arguments constantly in the community around, you use InVision, not Azure, or whatever it might be. And process and tools are really important, but they are things that are going to help you deliver. Research. We won the battle to actually get user research. You know, when I started my career, when I walked in a room, they said, "Who the hell are you?" But actually now, user experience is embedded, the job titles we all carry with us across many of the organizations. But coming from the background of safety engineering, much of what we did in that world was driven by behavioral design, psychology. We had tools and techniques that enabled us to look for hazards and risks within the industries in which we worked. And actually what I see in the modern UX professional a lot, and I do an awful lot of interviews at Nemensa, I lead a very large team, is people unable to make a design decision, and I call this using research as a shield. Don't get me wrong, pretty much my entire career is user research. However, when user research starts becoming literally a form of paralysis, I feel like I should be able to put a design in front of any member of my team and ask their opinion. They might be wrong. We probably will research it further. But if I see someone even refusing to put forward a design opinion, I feel that's a problem. And there are tools and techniques that the safety engineering sphere had created, which enabled us to make these kind of more positive, informed decisions. And finally, everywhere you look, you'll see words like disruption, innovation, value, needs. These are all good things. I'm not disagreeing with this. However, it is, in my opinion, all of these things, a movement towards a focus very much upon let's give the user more. Let's ship some more features, which can be a good thing. However, you can have the best tools and the best process, and probably you've hired the best staff, and it is still possible to make something that's shit. How? You look at the individual components of each of the disciplines involved, they all did a good job. Something's falling between the cracks. So let's take a step back, because if things are falling between, if it is possible, this is not all teams obviously, but if it is possible to make a bad product or a bad service or a bad system, if you work in digital, like making a website or an app, I'm sure many people in this room, when they've been up against a tight deadline in digital delivery, have probably said the phrase, well, you know what, at least no one's going to die, right? But looking to the next generation of design challenges, we talk about things like automation, artificial intelligence, and basically the embedding of digital in our much more real-world physical spaces. Let's think for a moment about how we could design an experience. Now, if you're in my team in the audience, I'm sorry, you've seen this before. But one of the most simplistic models I've tried to use for user experience over the years to help with clients and new members of the team is what I call the value versus pain model. And in simple terms, user experience will be good if the value that you obtain from engaging with that system outweighs the pain that it takes to use it. So in the early days of digital, I don't think Amazon was ever going to win any kind of beautiful design awards. But actually, the utility that Amazon carried with it at that time in the burgeoning kind of e-commerce space far, far, far outweighed the pain of a bit of a shitty web design. But coming back to my point about modern trends, we've shifted. Everywhere I look is people with post-it notes on walls, and that's good, I know, we all love a good yellow post-it. But nobody seems to want to talk about the other side of the equation anymore. It's not cool. I used to have usability in my job title at some point. I was also once called a higher ergonomist, which makes you sound like you're a member of a religious order. And I've just pressed the wrong button on my slide. So we swung a bit that way. I'm going to do my Jon Snow impression now. We swung this way. But what I want to talk about today is the other side of the equation. The user experience design community is built up of a plethora of different disciplines, and rightly so. I'm sure everybody in this room has come from all different areas and all different places. What I wanted to talk about is what I call the forgotten disciplines. And that's everything that is in kind of the top part of this diagram. So my traditional training would have been in human factors and ergonomics, which is basically what we call user experience in a safety engineering context. Human-computer interaction. As we look to the future of things like automation and AI and embedding digital in all sorts of products and devices, it is the skills that these people learned, hard-fought battles in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that I feel will be revisited. So what I'm going to do really for the rest of the talk is I want to give you three stories, I suppose, of tools and techniques and lessons learned that I hope the user experience community doesn't forget. When reactor 4 on the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded on the early hours of the 26th of April 1986, it was widely considered to be an impossible event. There was no way a nuclear reactor could explode. And yet, if you've worked in safety engineering, Chernobyl, you are forced to study it and study it again. It is the poster child of an example of how bad design met human behavior in the most catastrophic of circumstances. There were many aspects to this Chernobyl disaster, and I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with the recent HBO television series, which actually is very, very good if you haven't seen it. And it is currently the highest rated TV show in the history of IMDb. There were many aspects at play, and I'm not going to go into the details, particularly, 1980s Soviet era UI design. But I think if you were to take one thing away from the Chernobyl example, it's what we call in safety engineering optimizing violations. An optimizing violation, in simple terms, is a cheat. The system is designed in a certain way, and you are unable to use it the way you would like. So, as a user of the system, you change your behavior. You violate the way that the system is supposed to be used. But 9 times out of 10, when you find an optimizing violation, the optimizing bit, what it's really saying is you're cheating to try and do a good thing. So at Chernobyl, there were many factors at play, but a key problem was that the shift leader, the manager of that night shift running the safety test on the reactor, was optimizing and committing an optimizing violation. And what I mean by that is they'd already failed 3 safety tests. They couldn't afford to fail a 4th. So he was going to do whatever it took to do the good thing in his mind, which was pass the test, which included breaking multiple safety protocols. And I'm not going to talk too much more on the Chernobyl incident because I would hate it if I was halfway through the series. But optimizing violations is a key factor in safety engineering. Another example would be on oil refineries where I used to work. You would be amazed at the amount of burns on oil riggers' hands because pipes in oil rigs are very, very hot. And often you have a finite amount of time in your shift to go around and turn all the valves all the way around the oil rig. So if you've got the choice between climbing over the pipe that is in front of you with the valve about there, or using the officially designated stairs and ladder, what you'll probably do is hop over the pipe. But what you're doing there is an optimizing violation. People with me? Okay. The second example comes from my own career. And this, moving forward from 1986, this was 2006 again. And I used to do an awful lot of work in safety for the railways. And in this instance, I've used this example because it was a very early example of using autonomous vehicles in a transport system. So we were working for a European company, and I was called in, and they basically had autonomous trains. Now, an autonomous train, in simple terms, it travels along the track, and it sweeps, a sensor sweeps ahead of it, and what it's effectively doing is saying, is there anything in front of me on the track? And when it approaches a junction, the computer sends a signal, it says, pull the points. And the points, if everyone with me, are the parts that often connect and join on a track like that. So what you have is an automated system with the power to pull a set of points. On the right-hand side of the screen is the UI that the guys in the control room were using. And I don't know whether you can see it with the lights, but can you see like a bunch of purple dots? So every single one of those purple dots is a set of points. Now, believe it or not, when you work in safety, there isn't a giant button that someone accidentally pushes that blows up the oil refinery. Accidents are always a result of a great many things occurring. And they also occur typically in non-normal operations. So what I mean by that is maintenance. So if you were having maintenance conducted on this automated railway, the user in the control room would have to right-click on every single purple dot. And a menu would pop up from the right-click, and you would scan down the menu and click Isolate. And what that meant is you had isolated the points so that an automated computer could not request them. Is everyone still with me? I evaluated the UI and considered it from using my kind of human factors and ergonomics background, evaluated it against a series of human error matrices, and basically was able to come to the conclusion that I didn't feel it was fit for purpose. Because what you had was somewhere in the region of 30 or 40 sets of points, which the user would have to manually isolate all the way through. So you had a very repetitive, boring task with which there was a high chance of error where the consequences could be nasty. I wrote my report and gave it to the company. Went on to the next project. 6 months later, they decided to do maintenance one Sunday morning. They always do maintenance on a Sunday morning. And the very thing that I'd predicted happened. The guy in the control room isolated 19 out of 20 sets of points. And the automated vehicle drove along the track, and the computer said, hey, send me that set of points. so the points moved. When the points move, they complete an electrical circuit, effectively electrifying the entire line. 3 men were working on the track that day. 2 of them, fortunately, were standing on the side. The third one was holding all the wires. He had both of his hands amputated. In the inquiry, they tried to justify usual things that they do, like human error, and it's the maintenance guy's fault. But they found my report. So they settled out of court for a huge amount of money, and the guy and his family were able to start rebuilding their lives. And unfortunately, my next example is much, much closer in time. And that is Ethiopian Airways Flight 302, which crashed on March the 10th, 2019, 6 minutes after it took out from Addis Ababa. This is still an active inquiry, but I'm going to do my best to talk you through some of the initial findings. Before I go into the details of this, I want to say 2 things. The first one is I think a lot of people who know me know that I am terrified of flying. I've always had a phobia my entire life, so there probably is some bias in my understanding and portrayal of aeroplanes. The second thing is that air travel is by far and away the safest form of transport you will ever get in, by a country mile. Airplanes are incredible pieces of engineering. So the question has to be, how is it possible in the space of a number of months for 2 21st century modern airliners to fall from the sky with full loss of life? I wanted to put this photo up, and I'm going to go into this incident in a moment, but I appreciate that many people in the room probably don't work in this field. They might do in the future when you think about things like the introduction of AI, autonomous vehicles, things like that. But if you think it's possible for a design team to design a system that can kill a person, they can certainly design a system which can destroy a business. And this is the entire fleet of Southwest Airlines, which is still grounded, because nobody in the world is allowed to fly a Boeing 737 MAX 8 until indefinitely. I could explain the incident, but I found this video, and I feel this is, for many of the points that I'm talking about today, this is really, really pertinent, good description that I think I wouldn't be able to do it justice. This is the Canadian Transport Minister.
Okay, so when an airplane takes off and climbs, there is a sensor, there's more than one, called an angle of attack sensor that essentially measures the attitude of the aircraft, you know, how high, how steeply is it climbing, how shallow. And if you lift up the airplane too high, it can stall. So the angle of attack sensor was faulty on the Indonesian flight, and essentially gave the impression that the nose was too high. And so the software, it's called MCAS software, said, oh, I better get the nose down, and it can actually force the nose down. And the pilot said, no, it's not too high. So he countered that. And then a number of seconds later, the MCAS software kicked in again and tried to force it down again. And he said, no, I got to climb. And eventually, unfortunately, the pilot lost that fight with this software. And that is what happened with the Lion Air. So the result there is that the airplane tends to oscillate in this conflict between the software and the pilot. And that's what had some similarities on the Ethiopian flight.
I hope that most of the user experience professionals in the room would find a sentence like "the pilot lost the battle with the software" to be quite a scary sentence. If we're going to design systems, I believe, in my professional design opinion, no software should have the ability to overrule the will of the human. This is from the Wall Street Journal with this ongoing investigation. And this is my kind of harking back a little bit to my comments on process and how factors can come out of nowhere. They believed they might have a software fix for this issue in January 2019. But then the Trump administration had a government shutdown, and for 5 weeks, nobody was allowed to ship any software. Flight 302 out of Addis Ababa crashed on March the 10th, killing 157 people. So, those 3 case studies, what I want to do now, I was talking at the beginning about many of the skills that I don't see necessarily spoken about and we may need for the future. Those 3 examples all pull upon at least one, or maybe all, of these various design techniques and ways of thinking that the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society was using in the 1970s. Optimizing violations, the shift manager at Chernobyl, repeatedly cheating and actually trying to overcome and work against the system. If ever you see in the design, in user research, or maybe in the early observations of a product or a piece of software that you're designing, if you find optimizing violations, they're kind of like gold, because you're like, that. Not only is that painful, it's also a massively unmet need. Human error, the railway control room. Do any of us think that giving 30 or 40 monotonous user interface click and drag tasks, where the consequence of making a mistake with one of those monotonous routine tasks could result in serious injury, is a good piece of UI design? Allocation of function. Clearly, how many of us are starting to work on systems where maybe you need to stop and ask yourself, what is the role of the computer in this system, and what is the role of the human? When I worked for people on Eurofighter, we used to joke to all the engineers. They'd say, oh, I designed the landing gear, I designed the aeroplane, I designed the wings and the engine. And they'd say, what do you design? And I'd say, well, I designed the squidgy bit that sits in the middle. Mental models. Kind of used in the UX community today, kind of massively misunderstood and abused. One of the best examples of mental models from the world of safety engineering was in I think it was 2005. I spent a year studying the dangers and behavior of people who use level crossings in the UK. And it's one of my fondest examples where they couldn't understand why people in Land Rovers keep driving through red flashing lights at level crossings. Turned out we actually managed to speak to some survivors who have quite a unique perspective on the incident that they've just experienced. I shouldn't laugh, sorry. Every time we interviewed a survivor or someone in a near-miss incident, they said, but it should stop in 70 meters. Most humans, when they pass their driving test, are taught the stopping distances of cars. If a car traveling at 70 miles an hour is doing this, it'll take 70 meters to stop. You're not taught about trains. So what the users were doing is they were basically faultily applying. They had a wrong mental model. So they would pull up to the junction, and they would look down the track, and they would see the train, and they'd go, he'll see me, and he can stop in 70 meters, so therefore, I'll cross. Turns out most people aren't very good at basic physics. A freight train weighs about 1,000 tons, and is probably traveling about 80 miles an hour. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but it isn't stopping in 70 meters. So I think if you take one thing away from today's talk, if you are interested in this, and if you're working in fields where you're finding yourself embedding digital in other places other than just a website, you could do a lot worse than to start to think about some of the traditional techniques that we used in human factors and ergonomics. But let's look to the future. I appreciate the content of the last 10 minutes of my presentation has been quite heavy. I want to reassure you, I don't want to be the harbinger of doom. I love technology. I love the potential of all of the exciting things that are coming our way. But what I want to remind people of potentially is that there are some incredible opportunities that we are going to see and witness. But don't try and reinvent the wheel. We may well have to start applying some of these tools and techniques in entirely brand new contexts. a lot of us who might work exclusively in digital might start to ask questions, but when you wear your safety hat, or I put you in the context of a safety situation, phrases that we routinely use in digital, quite frankly, are terrifying. I've just formed a startup where I've invented a brand new type of elevator, and my elevator is going to fly up and down 40 stories as fast as you can. But it's okay, it's an MVP. Does anybody want to get in it with me? Has anybody heard of the Swiss cheese model? I knew you would. It's a lovely metaphor that I routinely come back to, and I think is used in safety engineering, but can help people think about some design problems. As I said before, there isn't the giant red button in the oil rig that if Homer Simpson accidentally mashes keypad, the whole thing blows up. Most accidents or safety critical errors are a result of a series of unfortunate events occurring. Boeing, in this first slice, their business analysis units correctly identified that what they needed was a new form of plane that could compete with the Airbus A320. Their business analysis was spot on. They did need to compete in that space. The development team that invented the MCAS software, I bet they're a good development team. I bet they're really good at what they do. The designers who moved the engines on the old model 2 meters forward and then affected the aerodynamic adjustments of the plane, they were doing good engineering. And yet, one event after another, finally, the Trump administration shut down. Something completely left field that prevents the shipping of a software fix results in tragedy. But let's take this back from from that kind of topic. Let's just think about the teams we're in. We're in a fast, agile sprint. The UX has got his head down. I've done some research and I'm doing it as fast as I can because I know I've got 2 weeks and I'm going to throw it over the wall to the designer who's going to do it, and they are doing it because we are moving fast. And then the designer throws it over to the development team. And yes, we're here at Collaborate, and many teams are really good at collaborating. But hopefully, if you take one thing away from my talk today, is that we're all good at what we do. The danger isn't in the silos. The danger is where they touch, where the cracks form, where your worldview doesn't quite align, and nobody's really thought about the bigger picture. So in conclusion, I believe our industry is focused on processes and tools too much at the moment. Some of us are doing really good collaboration, but actually look in the mirror and say, are we really collaborating in the team that I'm in? Or am I just trying to deliver really fast? Our obsession with value, KPIs, things we're going to measure that the boardroom we're really interested in, blinds us to risk. And in the next generation of design challenges that we face, I think we need to start talking about risk again. Emerging technologies and the embedding of digital everywhere. I love this phrase, everywhere. There's a book, I think his name's Adam Smith. I can't remember exactly, it's a great book. Creates really interesting questions, but my God, some of those contexts are terrifying. The example of the driverless car. I've been talking to the Transport Systems Catapult in the UK. Now, anybody who doesn't know, they are the innovation arm of transport for the UK government. And they have been driving driverless cars around Milton Keynes. I think they're a bit cowardly, to be honest with you. If you're going to pick a city in the UK to drive a robot car, Milton Keynes, right. It's just a square. But they came to me and they went, John, Nemenso's really good at accessibility, so let's talk about a driverless vehicle from an accessibility perspective. It could be awesome. And indeed, the UK government are currently right now doing something called Movement as a Service, MaaS, they call it. And the idea is that the elderly and disabled could be the first generations to really benefit from an autonomous vehicle rollout. That's great. But I was with them for about 30 seconds before I asked them a question which really annoyed them. The autonomous vehicle is booked via an app on your phone. And the entirely blind person is sat on their sofa in their home, and they have managed to use the entirely accessible app and book that car. So the robot car arrives. So I said, that's brilliant. And they said, yeah, they won't need carers. I said, great. I said, how does the blind person walk from their sofa to the car? Oh, we hadn't thought about that. The engineering team won't be asked that question. They've done a brilliant robot car. It's this bigger picture stuff that I kind of want to just get people to maybe go away from today's talk with kind of have that in the back of your mind and ask. And finally, is the latest generation of UX design professionals equipped for some of these questions? And if you're not, my request is please don't try and reinvent the wheel. Perhaps look a little bit wider or look back into the history of our discipline to find the tools and the techniques that could actually benefit you in some design challenges. He says, breaking his leg. So to close, I've been saying this for 17 years. The technology changes all the time, but the point is the same. The squidgy bit, the human, will do stuff that your tech team doesn't think they're supposed to do. So, thank you for listening. I know that I've talked about some subject matter which obviously is very serious. And like I said, I've wanted to give this talk for a while. So I hope that you found it, I wouldn't say you've enjoyed it, but maybe you found it interesting and maybe it's provoked a thought. But I did just want to save possibly the worst example yet for you. What the fuck is that? We can't even design a coffee mug. This is another one. User experiences badly flawed by misconceived preconceptions. Just double check. Please go away and make sure that you're not making your users stare at an animal's arse. This is the best book on user experience you've never read. It's written in the late 80s, I think, or early 90s. And it is a series of essays. And it's written in a storytelling way. It is a series of essays talking about engineering and design technology challenges. And it's just really, really interesting. Everything from Swedish rocket scientists in the Arctic to World War II experimental aqualungs where they realized that perhaps you shouldn't give a human 100% oxygen. And it's called Set Phasers on Stun after a very tragic story about the world's first cancer laser treatment machine where they actually managed to cure the cancer that the patient was suffering from, but the patient developed secondary cancers from the machine itself. Thank you for listening. I hope you've taken something from today.